Get started. I will keep an eye on the waiting room and let people in as they enter. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining a special session of the working group. I'm really pleased to have Judy Gearhart from the Accountability Research Center at American University joining us. Many of you know Judy already from her multiple affiliations that, in partnership with many of the organizations that we work with, including ILRF and now GLJ. She's also joined by Sari Heidenreich from Greenpeace. And I will turn it over to you, Judy, and Sari to take it away for the presentation, and then we'll join for Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chavi, for setting this up, and Esaba, it's really good to have the chance to speak to you all. And we read the Seize the Day report that you all put out in September on investor risks in their seafood supply chains. And I have to say, I have a very long history, not quite as long as David's history with the ICCR, but I go back to the early. Was in Mexico working as an interpreter and activist and organizer, and the Trinational Coalition for Justice in the Maquiladoras was coming south of the border at the time. So it's good to be with you all. Sari, why don't you go ahead and start the slides, because we definitely want to get to discussion. And I should note that we're joined by our colleague Heidi Schutenberg, who's also part of the Fisheries Governance Project. The Fisheries Governance Project has been working on this project for a while. Sari and I have been through thick and thin. And so we're excited to start presenting these corporate duties. So the full title of this project is go back, sorry. I'm gonna underline this. So it's defining corporate duties in seafood supply chains to prevent IUU fishing and labor rights abuses on industrial fishing vessels. We had originally wanted to be much broader, and I know from your Seize the Day, looking at the full seafood industry, supermarkets and retailers have to look broader. And a lot of what we've done here will be relevant for other parts of the seafood supply chain, but we had to narrow it, mostly because of the way we've pegged it to international norms, which I'll get to in a second. So next slide.
Judy, can you just say what IUU fishing is, please?
Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which is really, I'm going to get to how it's tied to the worker rights abuses in the seafood supply chain. Okay. Sorry. Thank you for that. So the Fisheries Governance Project, we started in 2020. It's a funder practitioner working group. And we're really working at that intersection of illegal fishing and overfishing and advancing labor rights. So next slide. We work on 3 different pillars. One is international treaties, really pushing for their adoption and implementation. The other one is this corporate duties document, really looking at what's the role of industry at all levels in perpetuating, exacerbating, and also, we hope, potentially mitigating both overfishing and labor rights abuses. And then the third pillar is really improving fisher empowerment. So we talk about enforcement and victim protection, but really we're trying to look increasingly at how do we empower fishers. And as part of that working group, my organization, ARC, released with the FGP a report on fisher organizing, which is important to know because as we talk to companies about human rights due diligence and the need to engage stakeholders, we need to point them to the fact that there are a growing number of fisher unions and fisher organizations they can engage with. So next slide. So the organizations involved with this, with the Fisheries Governance Project, have over time, well, obviously because USAID is there and they're no longer in existence. Heidi was one of the founding members of the Fisheries Governance Project while she was at USAID. And so we still have Heidi with us, fortunately. But the Global Labor Justice, my old organization, the Accountability Research Center, my current organization, which is a research institute at American University, and Greenpeace, Pew Charitable Trusts, Environmental Justice Foundation, and then several of the private foundations. So next slide. Why do we look at IUU, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing? Yeah, because it's highly correlated with labor rights abuses. About 10 years ago, there were a rising number of scandals of distant water vessels, industrial fishing vessels engaged in IUU fishing, and we also found high levels of forced labor and other labor rights abuses on those vessels. This, I think, for everybody within ICCR, this is just common knowledge, right? Bad management follows bad management. If you're willing to break the law on your fishing, on where you're fishing, when you know you're not supposed to be fishing in those areas because of overfishing, because of endangered species and endangered fisheries, you're really not going to think twice about abusing the rights of those fishers. And I think one of the points you all make in your Seize the Day report is the cost cutting and the competition in this industry has just really winnowed it down. Think about factories collapsing in Bangladesh and workers' rights to organize being repressed and women being beaten. It's very similar, right? You have vessels that are overfishing, they're really in bad condition, and they're doing, the infrastructure's bad and the labor rights are bad. So we really are looking at how do we change incentives and regulatory structures, which is why we're excited to be talking to you. Next. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir on that. So defining corporate duties. Why did we put this together? And how did we put it together? So we started with a whole landscape scan. And at the time, sorry if you can hear my dog. We started with a lot of organizations, especially environmental organizations and labor rights organizations that had asks to companies. They were telling global corporations what they needed to do, but they were sort of varied and they had there were differences that weren't aligning. And there wasn't really a lot of specificity on the labor rights side. So we scanned all the more than 20 organizations. We pulled from them environmental organizations, worker-led organizations, trade unions, and then we've developed over time the corporate duties document that you received. And Chavi was good enough to give us some input at the very end. And we've really been aligning this because our goal for today's conversation is we're looking for endorsements. We would really like to get as many civil society organizations endorsing the corporate duties as possible, and then go out publicly to try and get companies to start to implement. Next slide. Thanks, Sari. Why are we calling them corporate duties? I want to highlight this because we're trying to both define the high bar and also define, this is a must. These are not optional. So we really peg them to international human rights law and international standards. So the main international standard or norm for preventing IUU fishing is the Food and Agriculture Organization's Port State Measures Agreement on IUU fishing. And then, of course, the ILO Fundamental Principles on Rights at Work and ILO C-188 on work and fishing. Those are some of the core pillars. There are many other key documents coming from the UN system that are pegged within this as reference points. But the language we drew is kind of drawing on those international norms to convert it to what are we needing to see from companies. Again, you can't really address forced labor at sea, and I think this is important. If companies are looking at avoiding forced labor import bans and really trying to address the risks in their supply chain, we need them to think about being proactive. And to be proactive, you've got to address more than just forced labor. looking for IUU fishing, looking for human rights, the broader enabling rights issues like freedom of association, collective bargaining is going to be important in there. If you neglect one, you undermine the other. If you neglect to look at the overfishing and the IUU fishing, you're going to undermine the human rights part. So, and I think, industry complicity, you all are on top of that because of the Seize the Day report. So let's move on. All right. So we broke this down into 4 topic areas to really get at this nexus between IUU fishing and labor rights. We started with fishing vessel transparency because you need to know your vessels. You're never going to really establish responsibility in the supply chain if you don't know the vessel and what that vessel is doing, what that vessel looks like. The second thing is traceability. And I think this is probably familiar for most of you. If you're going to conduct due diligence, you have to do it at all stages of the supply chain. So traceability becomes important. Fortunately, in seafood, there's the GDST, the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, which has been around for a while, and they have been aligning key data elements and working towards creating an interoperable system for both among governments and companies for reporting on issues related to traceability, but they are now expanding into social. So there's a big reference to the GDST because it's a continuing dialogue, and they will stay at the fore of what needs to be collected in terms of both the environmental and social issues related to traceability. And I might come back and see if Sari wants to comment more on the transparency and traceability piece at the end. The other 2 big pieces are labor rights and working conditions. Obviously, the labor rights are, universal within the UN guiding principles. These are sort of absolutely necessary, the whole set of core labor rights. But in order to make those operable, we needed to add duties on working conditions. You really can't ensure those labor rights if you don't also address the working conditions. So next slide. Okay. So I'm going to take a second here. This is where I have a few examples of what we put into the corporate duties. The way the document is set up, it's 4x3. So you have the transparency, traceability, rights, working conditions. And then we broke it down to look at what are we asking of retailers and buyers and importers, but then what are we asking of the suppliers on the ground? And then the third column out there is what are we expecting them to be asking of governments? We know from tracking the work of the Seafood Task Force in Thailand and now more broadly that they're talking to governments, the large corporations. So we want them to be transparent about what they're saying to governments. If they're saying to us that they're advocating for ILO conventions 87 and 98 on freedom of association and collective bargaining, we want them to be transparent about that. Truth is, we actually know that a lot of times suppliers are not advocating for those rights. They may say it in their policy, but they're quite happy to let the government continue to repress those rights. It's a bit the same for the Port State Measures Agreement on seafood vessel transparency. We want their help in pushing for regulations. We can't have companies just saying, oh, well, there's a lack of implementation, lack of regulation, and then behind closed doors saying something else. So the more we can get them to come out in public and speak to that is important. And I have to give credit to Pew Charitable Trust. This has been something that they have been really pushing for. And I recognize it's a double-edged sword to ask companies to do that, to do this kind of advocacy, but it became a decision of they're doing it anyway, let's get them to be transparent about it. So that's where that's at. And I think that's kind of a new piece for this kind of work, this kind of a document. So what do we mean by outcome-based actions? And I think this is a really challenging piece of corporate reporting. So many times, I'm sure you've all read corporate reports where it's saying we have a policy on X, but that doesn't really tell you much. And we need to move past the policy on X. That's why we're looking for human rights and environmental due diligence reporting. Or I know your Seize the Day report talks a lot about human rights impact assessments. What are the vulnerabilities you found? But then also, what are you doing about it? So, for example, on the anti-IUU fishing, we could have companies commit to only buying from ports that are being inspected under the PSMA standards. In labor rights, and this is, I think, a really important piece to all of this, we tried to pepper throughout ways that we're asking retailers to look at their financing, right? Don't just tell me that you have a policy against forced labor. Don't just tell me that you're telling your vessels you absolutely will not buy from them if they're found to have forced labor. We need them to actually look at what's the pricing look like, how to do the financing to ensure remediation of forced labor. If you haven't thought about what are you going to do if it happens, you haven't really thought about how you're going to prevent it. Another example I'll pull out from here on working conditions, right? So we have under working conditions, we get into grievance and remedy. And we're really pushing and saying companies, you need to talk to the trade unions. You need to sign an agreement with unions to ensure remedy. And really, I think there's been such a long history, not just in seafood, but in many different industries where companies are saying we support freedom of association, collective bargaining, but actually talking with the representative worker organizations is anathema. And so we need to get past that. We need to create that dialogue space. We need to push forward with a change in the way they relate. Because if you're really committed to ensuring remedy, then you should be talking to the organizations that are most involved in pursuing remedy. And that is pretty much everywhere we've looked, the trade unions or the representative fisher organizations. I'm not going to go through all these examples, so let's move on to the next slide. I can come back if you all want. So this is just, I think you're just going to click through the animation here. We're going to go a little quickly on this so we can get to Q&A. So the fishing vessel transparency is set up in terms of identifying the vessel, tracking where the vessel goes. And there's great technology for that now from Global Fishing Watch. If there's transshipment at sea, it needs to be monitored and really documented. If you need to ensure there's observer coverage of your fishing vessels, and if not that, and also include electronic monitoring of activities on the vessels. And then again, like I already mentioned, ports of landing. What ports of landing is the fish coming into? Because we have on the vessel identification, like with the ports of landing, we have a lot of companies that are using vessels that are flying flags of convenience. They're not well-regulated states. And similar with ports of landing, you can bring your fish into ports where there's not much inspection. And that's how you pull it in and get it past the guys who are inspecting for, a boatload of shark fins or a boatload of shark bodies without fins, whatever it might be. This kind of thing is not going to happen in a port of landing where there's a good inspection system under the PSMA. Okay, next slide. The next slide is the global dialogue on seafood traceability. That's really about data standardization. If the company's not engaging in data standardization and trying to really track this information in a way that's interoperable, they're not serious about addressing illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. And we see that as deeply correlated as well with the human rights side. So next slide. Just a note on this. So you probably are all familiar with the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work and the 5 core areas covered, the 10 conventions covering 5 issue areas, which is freedom of association, collective bargaining rights are guaranteed, no forced labor, child labor, and no discrimination. But the other piece, the 5th one, is health and safety. We broke that down into 2 pieces here, and that has very much to do with the industrial fishing fleet and the migrant fishers on it. So it's ensuring occupational safety and health on the vessel and access to medical care and social security, which is really of critical importance, especially if fishers are being denied the ability to go to port or get off the vessel when they're seriously ill. So those last 2, that breakdown comes from ILO Convention C-188. That's why we did that. So the last one on the content here is working conditions. And these are really telling. If you are not looking at these issues, you're probably not able to uphold the rights that were just cited in the prior slide. And the language we have in there about working and rest hours, wages and compensation, that is all coming very much from the ILO C-188 and what the global trade unions are pushing for. The International Transport Workers Federation has been a close advisor on a lot of this. Communications, I know your Seize the Day already talks about Wi-Fi at sea, so that's also really core here. And maximum time at sea, now that one we know we're being rigorous. We're saying 3 months at sea. But that is very much something that's coming from consultations with the international union federations working with distant water fleets. The recruitment process and grievance mechanisms. I just want to say one piece here because ARC is about to put out a report that's very much looking at company policies on recruitment. And this goes back to what I said earlier about companies putting out a policy but not implementing it. A lot of companies are supporting the employer pays principle. But the employer pays principle, they have no way to implement it. And so we really, in this document, try to get at what are some of the pieces that would demonstrate you're implementing this employer pays principle. You have to be tracking the recruitment agencies in the sending country and the receiving country and the vessels and all of that. So we're really trying to go past that veneer. Okay, next slide, Sari. I think we're almost to your part. So how to use this document. We are not building the next certification. We do think it can be a really good guide for human rights and environmental due diligence. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a bunch of language in there about areas where retailers and buyers could be setting up budgets and looking at how they share the financing on implementation. So I think that's got to be one of the things I hope we can start pushing companies to do. Don't just say you told your vessel suppliers to do it. Show us how you're putting it in your budget. And I think the next slide goes to Sari, unless you want to comment on anything else.
No, I'm eager to get to questions. Thanks, Judy, for representing all of that. So as Judy mentioned, the next steps for this, we've spent a while drafting, and I won't tell you how long. It's only slightly embarrassing, but I think you do see it in the final product. I think we're really thrilled with where it landed and how ambitious it is. So as Judy mentioned, we're now bringing this to civil society for endorsements. And we have a couple of endorsements already from, for example, the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable from my organization, Greenpeace. And we're just in those early stages of talking to our close friends about this document. And then we want to share it, with the world and specifically get it into spaces where seafood corporations are going to see it, because that's really what this is about raising the bar and raising their behavior. And we have a plan also in place because we know, we've done consultations, as Judy mentioned, with a small group, but now as it's going out farther into the world, we know that we'll get more valuable input. And so we're really welcoming that and taking that in and have a plan to put out a set of FAQs and explanatory notes, different things that can help build this out as folks raise issues. And that is really one way that you could also get involved in addition to endorsing, is if there's an area that you would be well suited to help build out an explanatory note or an FAQ for, that's something that we would really welcome conversation around. And yeah, if on the endorsement process, just to get the logistics out of the way, if you're interested in signing, basically we want signers who are going to be enthusiastic about sharing this with their membership, with their corporate partners, whatever the configuration of your organization might be, and allowing us to the Fisheries Governance Project to put your name and your logo on the document and on our website. And we're asking for endorsements by November 1st, although I'm wondering if that date I'm seeing in my notes here is maybe old, because that's in 2 weeks. So I'm gonna go with, we'll give you an updated deadline. But yeah, I look forward to jumping into conversation, and I'm happy for questions on mic or in chat, however folks prefer.
Great. Thank you so much. What a great presentation. And we also have time for